Imagine standing outside your own home, a newborn pressed against your chest for warmth, while the man who promised to love you forever looks into your eyes and chooses someone else. Imagine the door slamming shut, the sound echoing louder than the storm around you as his mistress stands beside him, smiling while snow falls heavier by the second. The cold cuts through your coat, your child stirs in confusion, and for a moment the world feels unreal, as though you've been pushed out of your own life and left to freeze in its shadow. That was me. That was the day I understood that vows can be broken, trust can be mocked, and love can be twisted into something cruel enough to leave a mother and her baby outside in the bitter winter night. They thought that by closing the door, they had closed me out of the story. They believed the storm would swallow me whole, that my silence would keep their secret safe. But storms do not silence the truth, and a mother's endurance is not so easily broken. The very night they left me out in the cold became the beginning of something they could never have imagined. Because when you strip a person of dignity, when you laugh as they hold their child and beg for warmth, you plant the seed of consequence. My husband thought he had won by choosing her, by choosing comfort over loyalty, desire over family. He didn't realize that in betraying me, he had already set the trap that would one day take everything he thought he owned. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But how does a wife forced into the snow by the man she trusted most find the strength to turn the tables? How does someone like me, Anna Parker, carrying nothing but my newborn in the dead of winter, fight back against betrayal that cut deeper than the cold itself? These questions haunted me in the hours and days that followed, because at first all I could see was the door shutting, the smirk on Mark Parker's face, and the way Clara Evans, the woman he had chosen over his own family, stood by his side as if she belonged where I once stood. I was the one pushed out, but they were the ones who underestimated me. The night they laughed at my pain was the night they wrote the opening chapter of their downfall, even if they were blind to it at the time. Why did Mark bring Clara into our home and parade her so boldly before me? What was he protecting, or perhaps hiding, that made him risk everything for a mistress when he had a family? And what price would he finally pay when I decided that silence was no longer an option? These questions are not just my story. They are the threads of every betrayal where loyalty is abandoned for selfish desire. I stood outside that night wondering if my child and I had lost everything, but what I discovered later was that sometimes the one cast aside holds the power to bring the truth into the light. What started as humiliation in the snow would end as a reckoning in the warmth of justice. And by the end, my husband would learn what it means to lose not just wealth, not just reputation, but everything he once thought was untouchable. Before the storm, before the night when the door shut in my face, there was a beginning that looked almost perfect. I was Anna Parker, a young woman building a career as a graphic designer, living in Vermont, where winters are harsh but summers bloom with possibility. I first met Mark Parker on an ordinary day in an ordinary bookstore cafe. He was reaching for the same travel memoir I had been leafing through, a worn copy with its spine almost breaking. Our fingers brushed, and instead of letting the book go, he held it a moment longer, looked at me with a grin that was both confident and disarming, and said, "Maybe we should share it." That was how it started. Two strangers meeting over a book, laughter spilling out between coffee cups and the sense that fate had nudged us together. At the time, I believed in moments like that. I believed they meant something. Our early days were filled with long walks after dinner, hours of conversation about dreams, politics, and the kind of future we imagined building. Mark had a way of making plans that sounded solid, like stepping stones laid out on a clear path. He wanted a family, a home, success that could be seen and measured. I admired that decisiveness. It felt safe, like being with someone who could steady the ship even when the waves rose high. We married on a crisp autumn afternoon, golden leaves falling like blessings all around us, and for a time it felt like a movie come to life. I thought I had chosen a partner who saw me, who respected me, who would be by my side no matter what storms came. I was wrong, but it would take years for me to see how wrong. There were signs, faint at first, easy to dismiss. At family dinners, Mark's jokes sometimes landed at my expense. He would laugh about my cooking experiments, my clumsy attempts at gardening, and though he said it with a smile, there was an edge underneath. His parents chuckled along, and I tried to tell myself it was harmless. I wanted to belong in his world, to be accepted without question. I told myself all families had quirks, all couples teased, but over time those small dismissals settled into my memory like tiny cracks in glass, barely visible but there all the same. And then there was Clara Evans. She entered our lives under the label of just a family friend. She was younger than me, vibrant in ways that drew attention, and quick with compliments that seemed generous at first. She praised Mark for his ambition, told me how lucky I was to have someone like him, and smiled with a brightness that always lingered a little too long on him rather than me. I wanted to trust her. I wanted to believe that my husband's friendship with her was as harmless as he claimed. But something in me tightened every time I saw them together, even in group settings, even when I told myself I was imagining it. She knew how to stand close enough to be noticed, but never far enough away to be invisible. Looking back, she wasn't just a visitor in our lives. She was studying the cracks and waiting for her chance to widen them. Years passed, and life looked steady on the outside. Mark was thriving, Clara was around, and I was focused on our home and my work. But every small smirk, every backhanded comment, every moment where Mark brushed off my concerns was a stone laid on the road toward betrayal. I didn't see it then. I chose to believe the promises he repeated, the charm that once swept me off my feet. I told myself that families laugh, friends visit, and husbands sometimes forget to notice when their wives feel left out. I told myself it was fine, but memory is sharper in hindsight, and every detail I once dismissed became undeniable when the storm came. Looking back, the signs were there, but I didn't see them until it was too late. December in Vermont carries a weight that presses against the windows, a silence heavy with snow and wind. By Christmas Eve, the Parker home was dressed like a picture-perfect holiday card. A tall tree stood in the living room, its branches strung with golden lights while wreaths hung neatly on the doors. To anyone driving past, it looked like a place of warmth, the kind of home where family gathered to share joy. But inside, the air was colder than the storm outside. It wasn't just the weather, it was the quiet tension that grew with every hour. Mark moved through the house with his usual authority, his phone never far from reach, his eyes glancing past me instead of at me. And Clara Evans, who had suddenly been invited to spend the holidays, floated from room to room as though she belonged there more than I did. At first, Clara masked her presence in politeness. She complimented the food, admired the decorations, offered to help with the baby as though she was part of the family. But the longer she stayed, the more her tone sharpened, the more her words carried a sting wrapped in sugar. Late in the evening, while I rocked my daughter upstairs, I heard Clara's voice drifting up from below, low enough to suggest secrecy but loud enough that I could catch each syllable. "She doesn't know what she's doing," Clara said, her laugh quick and dismissive. "Some women just aren't cut out for this. Mark deserves better." My breath caught, my grip tightening around my child. It wasn't just words, it was a declaration. Clara had positioned herself not as a guest, but as a replacement. When I confronted Mark, I expected at least hesitation, a denial, something that would show me my husband still saw me as his wife, the mother of his child, his partner. Instead, what I found was his smirk, the same one I had seen at dinners when I became the punchline of his jokes. He didn't defend me. He didn't shield me. He stood by Clara. His words were clipped, final, as if my pain was an inconvenience. "You're too sensitive, Anna. Clara's only trying to help." But the truth was clear in the way he looked at her, in the ease with which she stood beside him. He had already chosen his side, and it wasn't mine. It was near midnight when the confrontation reached its peak. Clara stood behind him, arms folded, her smile thin and victorious. Mark picked up my coat, thrust it toward me with a shrug that dismissed everything we had built together. "Maybe you need some air," he said, as if tossing me out into a winter storm was nothing more than a moment's solution. My daughter stirred in my arms, crying softly, her face pressed against me for warmth. I remember staring at him, searching for even a flicker of the man I once married, the man who had once reached for a book in a cafe and promised me a future. But there was nothing. Only indifference. Only betrayal. They pushed me into the cold as if I was disposable. But you can't bury a mother's rage in the snow. The wind met me first, sharp and merciless, tugging at the blanket wrapped around my baby. My boots crunched against the ice as the door closed behind me with a sound more permanent than any vow I had ever spoken. I pulled the baby closer, feeling her small body tremble against mine, while laughter, faint but cruel, echoed from the other side of the wall. That was the sound of a family I no longer belonged to. That was the sound of love stripped bare. The snow kept falling, covering my tracks almost as quickly as I made them, as though the night itself wanted to erase me. But I kept walking, one step, then another, the weight of my daughter the only warmth I carried. That was the night I lost a husband, the night I lost a home, the night I lost the illusion that I was safe where I thought I belonged. And as I disappeared into the storm, I whispered to myself a truth that would never leave me. I might have been forced out, but I was not finished. And that was the last time I saw that house as my home. The storm swallowed me whole that night. Snow pressed down on the roads, the wind cutting through every layer of fabric I had wrapped around myself and my daughter. My arms ached from holding her close. My breath burned from the cold, and every step felt heavier than the last. Houses lined the street, their windows glowing with warmth, but behind every door I passed was a family gathered in comfort, unaware that a mother and her child had been thrown into the dark. My phone had already died, and for a moment I thought this would be the night that ended us. But then, out of the blur of white, a small porch light flickered. The door creaked open, and an older man stepped out, his frame weathered, his eyes sharp with concern. His name was Henry Miller, a retired veteran in his 70s, a man who had seen his share of battles, but perhaps none like the one I was fighting in silence that night. Henry didn't ask many questions. He simply saw the baby trembling in my arms, the frost clinging to my coat, and motioned me inside. The warmth of his home hit me like a wave I had nearly forgotten existed. The scent of wood smoke and the faint trace of apple pie filled the air. He brought me a quilt that looked older than me but softer than anything I had felt in weeks. For the first time since the door had closed behind me, I allowed myself to breathe. My daughter's cries softened as the heat thawed her tiny fingers, and in that moment I knew we had been given not just shelter, but survival. Henry told me his daughter would be arriving soon, and that she would know how to help me. His words carried no judgment, only quiet assurance, the kind that restores your faith in humanity when those closest to you have stolen it. True to his word, Henry's daughter, Margaret, arrived within the hour. She was in her 40s, practical and warm, the kind of woman whose presence steadies a room. She looked at me, then at my child, and without hesitation said, "You're coming with me tonight." She drove me to her home where her family welcomed me like I was not a stranger but someone they had known all along. From there, I called my closest friend Hannah, who lived a town over. When she heard what had happened, she didn't ask for details. She simply said, "Come. You'll be safe here." In the days that followed, Hannah became my anchor, offering not only shelter but clarity. While I fought to make sense of betrayal, she reminded me of something I had forgotten, that respect is not something you beg for. It is something you demand by refusing to stay silent. While I pieced my life together, Mark and Clara were building theirs on lies. They posed as the perfect couple, hosting parties in the very house I had once decorated, laughing in photographs that spread across social circles. Clara clung to his arm, her smile wide. her eyes glinting with the triumph of someone who believed she had won. They paraded themselves through town as though I had never existed, as though my child was not a part of their story. Mark presented himself as a devoted partner, and Clara as the woman who brought him happiness. But beneath the glittering facade, cracks were forming. Their life was built on borrowed luxury and reckless spending, on Clara's whispered promises of wealth that was never hers to give. It was during those weeks of recovery that I made a choice. If Mark had cast me aside as though I were nothing, I would prove to him that I was not invisible. I began documenting everything: his messages, the timelines, the money he withdrew, the accounts he shifted. At first, it was only to protect myself, to ensure that one day when I stood in front of a judge, I would not be painted as the unstable wife he claimed I was. But as I dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Clara Evans, the woman who had stood beside my husband as I was forced into the cold, carried a past she worked hard to bury. Debts left unpaid in other towns, creditors who spoke her name with disdain, transactions that revealed more than friendship between her and men she had left behind. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. While they toasted champagne in their decorated home, I sat at Hannah's kitchen table with stacks of papers, highlighting transfers, printing out messages, and creating a trail that led directly back to them. Every withdrawal Mark made, every signature Clara pushed him to sign, every careless mistake they thought no one would notice, I noticed. And the deeper I went, the clearer it became. This wasn't just betrayal of a wife. It was deception, manipulation, and the beginning of a scheme that would unravel under the weight of evidence. I thought I had already lost everything the night I walked into the snow, but as I laid the documents side by side, a new truth emerged. I hadn't lost. I was only beginning to fight. And then, I found the document that changed everything. The document I found was more than a loose thread. It was the key that unraveled the entire fabric of Mark and Clara's story. At first glance, it looked like nothing. Just a bank statement folded into a pile of papers left behind in haste. But as I read it, line by line, my pulse quickened. Transactions had been rerouted, assets shifted into accounts not under Mark Parker's name, but under Clara Evans. Large transfers appeared just days after I had been forced out, amounts far beyond ordinary expenses. It became clear that while I was walking through the snow with my daughter in my arms, Mark was walking into Clara's trap. She wasn't just his mistress, she was the architect of his downfall. I began digging into Clara's past with more focus, and what I uncovered made the storm that night seem almost merciful compared to the storm that was coming. Clara Evans carried with her a history that stretched beyond Vermont, a string of debts, broken relationships, and names of people who refused to speak about her without bitterness. Public records painted a picture Mark had refused to see. Clara wasn't simply a woman chasing affection. She was a con artist who had perfected her craft over years, slipping into lives, drawing out resources, and moving on when her schemes ran dry. And now, she had her sights set on Mark Parker, not to build a future with him, but to strip him of everything he owned. With the help of a lawyer willing to listen, I began to build a case. Each bank transfer, each signed document, each text message where Mark downplayed my concerns became evidence not of my weakness, but of his complicity. Clara had convinced him to move assets into her name, assuring him it was a way to protect their future from legal complications with me. What he failed to realize was that she had no intention of protecting him. By the time he saw her true motives, it was too late. But I wasn't going to let it end there. I wanted the truth in writing, in front of a judge, in a place where their laughter would finally fall silent. The courtroom carried a weight heavier than the snow that had once pressed against my shoulders. I sat with my lawyer on one side, while Mark and Clara sat on the other. Clara wore her confidence like a mask, smiling as though this was all a performance she had rehearsed before. Mark looked uneasy, his bravado dimmed by the seriousness of the setting. And then the documents came out. Page after page of transfers, signatures, and records laid bare their scheme. Clara's smile faltered as her own handwriting appeared on screens for everyone to see. The evidence of financial misconduct was overwhelming, not just careless spending, but deliberate fraud. She tried to talk her way around it, weaving excuses and half-truths, but every word collapsed under the weight of proof. For years they had tried to strip me of dignity, to take my place in the home I built, to erase me from the future I thought we would share. They thought they could take my baby's future as well, leaving us with nothing but the memory of a slammed door. Instead, they lost theirs. The judge's ruling was clear. Clara Evans was guilty of fraud, and Mark Parker, though desperate to claim ignorance, was implicated by association. The accounts were frozen, the assets seized, the reputation they had paraded in public shattered before their very eyes. I thought that was the end, that exposing Clara, watching her mask crack in court, and seeing Mark finally cornered by the very woman he had chosen over me would be the final chapter. But life rarely ends on the first conclusion. As the gavel struck and the courtroom emptied, I realized something chilling. The biggest twist wasn't Clara's arrest. It was what came after. The verdict marked the beginning of the end for Clara Evans. She was sentenced, her freedom stripped away just as easily as she had once stripped others of security. The confidence she had paraded in public was gone, replaced with the silence of a woman who had finally been caught in her own web. For Mark Parker, the outcome was just as devastating. Without Clara to shield him, the truth of his choices came to light. He was not just a man who had betrayed his wife. He was a man who had allowed greed and pride to drag him into ruin. His finances collapsed. The home he once boasted about was sold to cover debts. Friends who had once smiled at his parties and praised his success turned their backs. The image he had worked so hard to maintain was gone, and with it, the comfort he had traded his family for. For me, the courtroom was not just a place of justice. It was a place of restoration. The judge awarded me full custody of my daughter, ensuring that her future would never again be threatened by the decisions of those who had abandoned us. Child support was ordered, and restitution from the assets Clara had stolen was placed in my hands. It wasn't about wealth. It was about security. About rebuilding the stability that had been stolen the night I was forced into the snow. When I walked out of that courthouse, my daughter's hand in mine, I felt the kind of strength that comes not from victory over others, but from refusing to let betrayal define the rest of my life. Years passed. My daughter grew, her laughter filling the rooms of the small but warm home I created for us. Birthdays were celebrated, milestones reached, and every day I promised her something simple, that she would never feel unwanted, never feel the sting of rejection I had once felt. I kept moving forward, and for a time, it felt as though Mark Parker had been left behind in another life, one I no longer had to carry with me. But stories rarely end so neatly. One evening, many years later, a knock came at my door. When I opened it, I found him standing there. Mark. His face was lined with years of disappointment, his posture slouched, his clothes no longer polished but worn with the weight of loss. He looked nothing like the man who had once laughed as I was cast out. His voice was quiet, almost broken. He asked to see our daughter, begged for a chance to explain, pleaded for an opening into the life he had forfeited. In his eyes, I saw desperation, the kind that comes when a man realizes too late what truly matters. For a moment, the memory of who he had once been flickered in my mind, the man I met in that bookstore, the man I thought would stand by me. But then another memory cut sharper, the snow falling heavy, the sound of a door slamming, the sight of Clara standing by his side as my daughter whimpered in the cold. That was the image I carried, the truth that would never leave me. And standing in that doorway, I remembered the snow, the laughter, the slam. This time it was me who closed the door. So now I leave you with a question. If you were in my place, if you were Anna Parker, standing in that doorway years later with Mark Parker begging to be let in, what would you have done? Would you have opened the door, given him a second chance to step back into the life he once chose to destroy? Or would you have left him outside in the cold he once forced me into, reminding him that actions carry consequences. There is no easy answer, but I want to hear yours. Share your thoughts in the comments below, because every decision in a story like this says something about who we are and what we believe justice should look like. And if this story left you stunned, know this: it is not the only story where betrayal turned into reckoning. There is another tale, one that will shake the very idea of loyalty and trust, where a woman faked her death and disappeared, only to reappear on the day of her husband's wedding, standing there when no one expected her to ever return. That is a story you will not want to miss. So subscribe for more stories where betrayal meets justice, where trust is tested, and where truth always finds a way to break through the silence. And before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.